Hello team, welcome back and let's discuss about the Kubernetes architecture in more details. Whatever we are learning in this course, that is definitely going to help you in the certification exam. Although you are not getting these topics directly in the curriculum, but believe me, they are going to help you. So let's discuss about the Kubernetes architecture in more details. So in earlier lecture, we discussed that there is something called the admin or the developer. They could be the single person or multiple person. They could be the systems itself. What they are doing, they are executing the commands on the Kubernetes cluster. In the Kubernetes cluster, we have the single node or multi-node, which is called the master node or the controller, and they basically are managing the multiple worker nodes. Worker nodes are executing the pods and the containers services on itself, and Kubernetes cluster is accepting the workload from API, CLI, or GUI. That is the high level architecture we discussed about the Kubernetes. Now, let's discuss about the component of the master node. So in Kubernetes master node, we have the multiple components. So here we have the admin or the developer who are basically issue the command to the Kubernetes cluster. These commands directly handled by the Kubernetes master node. And in Kubernetes master node or the controller node, these commands directly handled by the API server. API server is the component of the master node which will directly interact with the Kubernetes admin or Kubernetes developer. Whatever the command, whatever the API you are hitting on the Kubernetes, they directly will be received by the Kubernetes API server. So Kubernetes API server is the component of the master node which will accept the command from the developer or the outer world, and they will issue the response to the developer or the outer world. Another component of Kubernetes master node is the etcd, which is a distributed key value pair based database. That is something you can assume a backend service for the Kubernetes. Whatever the state of your Kubernetes cluster, that state must be saved in the etcd. So etcd is a database for your Kubernetes cluster which will store your Kubernetes cluster state. Another component of the master node is the control manager. What is control manager do? Control manager will basically control the complete control plane of your Kubernetes. That includes the node controller, replication controller, endpoint controller, and the token controller. So all these tasks are basically being managed by the control manager in your Kubernetes cluster. Another and last component of the Kubernetes cluster master node is the scheduler. Scheduler directly communicate with the API server, and it will decide that what resource need to be scheduled on what worker node. Scheduler is the component which will decide that this is the resource and this need to be scheduled on this particular worker node. So scheduler is something which will manage the resource deployment on the worker nodes in Kubernetes cluster. These are the four main component of your master node: API server, etcd, control manager, and the scheduler. So let's discuss few more details about them. Kube API server, that is the only interaction point to interact with the Kubernetes cluster. So if that component is present in your Kubernetes cluster, definitely that is some kind of a application in the Kubernetes cluster. And if that application is down, you would not be able to interact with your Kubernetes cluster. Kube API server accept the rest assured command to interact with the cluster resource. Either you are executing the commands from the GUI, either you are executing the command from a command line interface, or either you are directly executing the command by the API. Kube API server always accept the command in the rest assured format, right? Kubernetes only support the rest command. Even whenever you are executing the CLI based command on your terminal, in the background, that terminal is sending the REST request to the API server. API server accept that REST request, understand that REST request, and interact with the other resources in the master node. etcd or etcd, that is a database in your Kubernetes cluster. That is a distributed key value store for the cluster state. How many resources are running in your cluster, what is the status of these resources, what is the configuration of these resources, at which particular order the resources are being deployed, if anything happened to any resources anytime, what is the health check of these resources, what is the liveness probe or readiness probe of these resources. Every information, right, every information about your cluster and cluster state is stored in the etcd, and that is a distributed key value store. It means you can execute multiple services of the etcd and they must be in the replication with each other. That is why it is called distributed. That definitely there is no restriction that etcd is a single service which is running in the master node. You can execute multiple services for the etcd. And because this is a backend service or the database of your kubernetes cluster, I must recommend you need to externalize this particular service. I mean to say, keep etcd at separate servers, because that is a database, right? If your kube api server is down, you can recover that, but if your etcd is destroyed, you cannot create the cluster, you cannot recover anything because everything is in there, right? Even your complete cluster is destroyed, you can make the fresh cluster from the etcd, which is the backup of your existing running cluster. But if your database itself is crashed, there is nothing, your complete cluster is going to crash. So please make sure whenever you are going to configure the kubernetes cluster manually in your organization, etcd must be externalized, and there could be the multiple replication which is going to execute for the etcd. That is the one way. Another way, you can execute the multiple master node and they could be in the sync, right? Using this way as well, you are basically creating the distributed etcd because each master node have the copy of the etcd. Next is the kube scheduler. Kube scheduler basically regulate the task on the slave node. Kube scheduler is the component which is going to schedule the resources on the slave node. Kube scheduler ensure that which resource should execute on which slave. There could be the multiple factors which can affect the resource schedule, we will talk about it, but this is the service which will regulate the task on slave nodes. Another thing is the controller, so that is the thing which is going to manage the kubernetes job. Whatever the job kubernetes is going to perform on the worker nodes, that is being managed by the controller. Controller is something which will manage what are the commands is going to execute on the worker nodes, right? It will manage all the props and auto jobs whatever going to execute by that kubernetes cluster. So we have discussed about the component of the master node. So here we have the master node, and that master node is basically communicating with the worker nodes. So there could be 1 to n number of worker nodes available. There is no restrictions as it is. You can attach multiple worker nodes with your single kubernetes master node. Worker nodes are the actual resources which are executing your workload. In the worker node, you will find few component like kubelet, which is a kubernetes agent, kubeproxy, which is the another service which will manage the networking and subnetting in the worker node, and the container runtime. That is the service which will execute the containers, the pods in the worker node. So let's discuss about these. First, let's discuss about the kubelet. Kubelet is a Kubernetes agent execute on the worker node. Kubelet is something which will connect the worker node with the master node, which will accept the commands from the master node and issue these commands to the worker node. So if kubelet is down, your worker node is not attached with the master node. Kubelet is that agent which connect the worker and the master. Kubelet get the pod configuration from the API server and ensure the pods and container state on the worker, right? So it will get the configuration or it will get the command from the API server, which is the master node component, and it will execute that configuration on the node and ensure that what is the configuration I'm getting from the master, I am maintaining that configuration on the worker node. Then we have the container runtime. Container runtime will execute the pods on the worker node. That is the runtime environment which actually executing your containers. So in Kubernetes, containers execute in terms of the pods. What is pod? Pod is a basic logical access unit in the Kubernetes which executes the container, or you may say that containers execute within the pods, right? So that is a group of single or multiple containers with the shared storage and network. Within a single pod, you can execute a single container, and within a single pod you can execute the multiple containers. There is no limitations. Whatever the things which are executing in a single pod, they are going to execute the shared network and they are going to execute the shared storage. That's why if you have the multiple containers in a single pod, these containers can communicate to each other via over the local host. No different network layer is applicable for these. If two containers are running in a single pod, they can connect over the local host. Third and last component is the kube proxy. Kube proxy is used to manage the services in the Kubernetes. Here, service is a record which will make your application available to the outer world. See, whenever you are executing the containers in a pod, these containers are executing within the Kubernetes cluster. How the end user will access these applications? So for the end user, these services must be exposed, right? And in Kubernetes, the application expose over the service, and that service is basically managed by the kube proxy. Kube proxy ensure that the application is accessible over the service to the outer world or the outer parties. Later in this course, we will see what are the ways to access the service from the outer world, but kube proxy is that component which will manage the network and which will ensure that if service is running, that must be accessible to the outer world. So this is the basic structure of the Kubernetes, the components of the master node and the component of the worker node and the working model of Kubernetes. Right. I hope right now you are pretty much clear what is Kubernetes and what is the working model of Kubernetes. From coming lectures, we will see the installation of Kubernetes. Thank you, team. See you next time.